Good morning, everyone. So, in our last lesson, we said that the Roman Empire fell in the year 476 AD. We also said that this was what happened in the West, but did not specify what was going on in the East, where the empire survived for another millennium until the 29th of May of 1453. Today we're looking at exactly that, at the Roman Empire in the East, known to many of us as the Byzantine Empire. A famous scholar, John Julius Norwich, said that the Byzantine Empire had a Roman body, a Greek mind, and an Eastern soul, and I believe that this statement sums it up reasonably well. A bit of a disclaimer, Byzantium is literally my favorite period in history. There are 2.5 shelves of my library which are devoted almost exclusively to what happened immediately before, immediately after, and during the Byzantine period, so prepare for a long one. In particular, today we are going to talk about the following point. We're giving you a general introduction about the Byzantine Empire, what it was, what it wasn't. Then we're looking at Constantinople and at the three things I mentioned before. The Roman body, so the part that survived from the Roman institutions. The Greek mind, so what the Byzantines inherited from the ancient Greek world. And the Eastern soul, so essentially the role of Christianity and of other Eastern religions in the Byzantine mindset. Then we're going to look at whether it was really a matter of decline and fall, as it is often portrayed by historians who don't know any better. And then we're going to ask ourselves why it was significant. Moving on, so what was the Byzantine Empire? Now, the Byzantine Empire was, as we said already, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East. Okay, it was not something different, it was not something separate. If you're wondering what would have happened if Roman civilization had survived and continued into the Middle Ages, this is the answer. It would have been the Byzantine Empire. While they kept calling themselves Romans, and their idea of the sort of national idea that we are Romans and we all belong to the Roman state were very strong at the time throughout all the millennium of the existence of the empire. We called them Byzantines because the empire was based around the city of Byzantium, renamed Constantinople by Emperor Constantine in 313 AD, and which is now modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. And because until recently we did not really understand, we did not really know how much being called Romans, how much being Roman was important to them. It's like as if 1,000 years from now the United Kingdom was called the London Empire because of the importance of London, and because somewhere else in time another country called the United Kingdom had emerged, and future historians didn't want to mix the two. So, the Byzantine Empire changed a lot throughout the centuries. Initially, it comprised the entirety of the Eastern Mediterranean, as you can see in the first map here, showing the empire under Justinian. And as we said, under Emperor Justinian, it used to be just the eastern half of the Mediterranean. Then, under Emperor Justinian I, it was able to reconquer Italy, North Africa, and part of Spain from the barbarians that ruled them. Then we got the great disaster from the Byzantine point of view, of the 6th and 7th century. A combination of more and stronger barbarian invasions in Italy. We got the Lombards, combined with the very first appearance of the bubonic plague, the Black Death. It was not the first time it appeared in Europe, even though it's still written like that in the history manual. No, the first time was the Justinianic plague of the 540s, and it was a complete disaster. And it was followed by a long and epic war against the old Persian enemy, and as soon as the Byzantine had almost won, then out of absolutely nowhere, rise of Islam, and the armies led by the successors of the Prophet Muhammad just swept through across everything that they encountered. And after this series of events, for most of its history, the Roman or Byzantine Empire was limited mostly to Greece, Anatolia, Cyprus, and parts of southern Italy. At the bottom here you can see a map of how the empire looked around 1025. There are a few things I'm not entirely convinced about in this map, but let's move on. Now, let's say the center of the empire, the most important component of the empire from our point of view, because it's the one that left us most sources, was Constantinople. The political, religious and cultural life of the empire revolved around its capital in Constantinople, which, as we said, is modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. The city is located in one of the most strategic positions of the entire world, controlling the roads that go from Europe to Asia and the maritime routes that link the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It was, in short, at the crossroads of everything important, a position that allowed the city to become the richest and most populated one in the medieval world, with more than 500,000 people living there, even after the Great Plague and after the collapse of urban society in the 7th century. However, when you have an incredibly rich city located in an incredibly strategic position, you need to defend it incredibly well. And the Byzantines did exactly that. In the 5th century, they built the Theodosian Wall, named after Emperor Theodosius II, which was an elaborate and almost impregnable system of concentric fortifications. You see, there were not one, not two, but three levels of walls that were strategically placed, with moats and towers and all sorts of other features. And this system allowed the city to resist almost every single one of the more than 20 direct attacks it had to face throughout its history, which meant that on average it was one every 50 years. So if you don't remember the last siege of Constantinople, chances are your parents do, or your grandparents do. That's how frequent they were. Constantinople was also the seat of the imperial palace, the very nevralgic center of the empire, where all the important decisions were taken and were court intrigues between the people who vied for power, so the advisors of the emperor, the women of the courts, the generals, all these sort of intrigues and murders took place. It also still is the place where one of the most impressive monuments of all time is located, and I'm talking about the Church of Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, built by Emperor Justinian, the same who incredibly expanded the empire in the 6th century. It still stands today, even though it's been turned originally into a mosque and now it's a museum. Hopefully it will remain a museum for a while. It still stands today with its dome, its golden mosaics, and an atmosphere that makes it feel like really it's the connection between heaven and earth. Go and visit that if you can. I've recently been to Istanbul in February, and wow, just wow. I've been there several times, and every time it's like the first. I really miss that place. Moving on. What do we mean when we talk about the Roman body of the Byzantine Empire? One of the most interesting things about Byzantium is, in my opinion, how it maintained and transformed the Roman nature of the country, without any sort of neat break with the past. Even though the empire spoke Greek, and even though it was Christian, it still retained several Roman laws, institutions and characteristics, and most importantly for its survival, it maintained Roman military traditions. For most of its history, the empire was divided into military provinces called themata, or themes in English, which were ruled by a governor who had the title of strategos, which means ruler of soldiers. That's where the modern word strategy comes from. In every village, there were some families that worked as part-time soldiers in exchange for tax breaks and would answer the call to arms whenever the country was invaded. And as we said, that happened pretty often. There were several sieges of Constantinople, but the country was invaded at least once or twice a year. There was also a series of regiments of professional soldiers who were full-time soldiers, called the tagmata. They were units of mostly heavy cavalry, like the one in the picture, based around Constantinople. Many of the commands of the orders shouted by the officers in the tagmata were still in Latin, even though they spoke Greek, a fact which shows the resilience of the Roman heritage in the Byzantine world. This organization allowed the Byzantine Empire to survive and prosper during a period of huge changes and constant invasions. As we will see in a while, the ancient Romans had it very easy. The Byzantine got the short end of the stick in terms of the historical situation. Another very important part of the Byzantine civilization was its love for culture. While in Western Europe, for most of the Middle Ages, only the clergy could read and write, and not even every one of them, in the city of Constantinople, most of the population had at least basic literacy. Most of the population, even women, and that's an extraordinary thing. One of the best Byzantine historians, Anna Komnena, was actually a woman, and I've read a few Byzantine sources in my time, and her book is by far the most readable. The Byzantines also read, copied, and appreciated ancient Greek texts, and this is absolutely fundamental. They constantly discussed them, read them out loud occasionally during presentations at court. They did not just read the books so that wrote the books so that people could read them in the house. They would just read them out loud to other people. And they were able to keep the fire of learning, the fire of ancient learning, alive during what in Europe were the Dark Ages. Indeed, when the city of Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, it was the Greek refugees that escaped the Ottomans and went to Italy that brought with themselves the ancient Greek books that were so important for the beginning of the Renaissance in Europe. Ancient knowledge was not just useful for philosophical debates, however. It also allowed the preservation of military and technological knowledge as well. Many Byzantine generals were very cultured, had a very strong knowledge of the classics, and they were also very well read in military strategy, in books of military strategy, and there were several emperors, at least 3, at least 2. A third one is a maybe, but it's a strong maybe. Still, there were several emperors who wrote treatises on military strategy based on a combination of what they knew from the ancient texts and their own personal experience with warfare. For example, Nikephoros Phokas, who was is the strong maybe, who was a very victorious general and an expert in mountain warfare, wrote a book on tactics and a book on guerrilla warfare, the earliest book on non-conventional war in history, in the history of the Western civilization. So yes, culture was not just useful because culture is nice and learning is nice. It was also practical because it allowed them to preserve useful knowledge that they could use in battle against their enemies. The final aspect of Byzantine society that we need to discuss is its Eastern soul. Byzantium had a deeply Christian society, one in which religious controversies were as important as, for us, political problems. Ordinary people, instead of discussing things like Brexit, for example, argued about the nature of Christ. Is Christ 100% God, or is it like 50% God and 50% human? Or the relationship between Jesus and God inside the Holy Trinity. Is Jesus the Son of God? Has Jesus been created by God? And they discussed that. And we're not talking about only cultured people either. A Byzantine writer of the 4th century, or was it the 5th, claimed that if you went to the market to buy, I don't know, some fish or some cheese, you would hear every single person there discussing about the nature of Christ, discussing about theology, discussing about philosophy. Mostly Christian philosophy. Byzantium was deeply Christian, that needs to be kept in mind, but was not Catholic. The leader of its church was not the Pope in Rome, who is the leader of Catholicism still today, but the Patriarch in Constantinople, who is still the leader of the Orthodox religion today, even though it's complicated. The churches of Rome and Constantinople gradually lost touch with each other through the centuries. They started as a single Christianity, single Roman Christianity, and then you got the Catholics on the one hand and the Orthodox. It's like when you lose touch with an old friend and then you realize that you weren't maybe as good friends anyway. In 1054, the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope and the emissary of the Pope in Constantinople excommunicated each other, essentially telling each other to, go away. This resulted in a schism, which is a division within Christianity, which resists until today, and which was the beginning of the official Catholic and Orthodox divide in Christianity. Religion, however, was not just a system of beliefs, was not just something they believed. It was also an instrument of foreign policy. It was useful to tame the barbarians, because the Byzantines, being Romans, saw literally everyone else who was not a Roman as a barbarian. For example, when the Russians arrived in Constantinople for the first time in the 10th century, they were pagan, they were not Christian, and they were enemies of the Byzantines. They would just come down from the Black Sea, raid whatever around the southern coast of the Black Sea, and then go back. However, one day they sent some ambassadors to Constantinople, and these ambassadors saw the great imperial church of Hagia Sophia with its golden mosaic and huge dome, golden mosaics which include this one from the 14th century, and they believed they were in heaven. Their king essentially immediately converted to Orthodox Christianity, and the Russians became some of the strongest allies of Byzantium, and Russia, to this day, claims to be the successor of the Byzantine emperors. Now, we discussed the Roman Republic in the previous lessons and the Roman Empire, and my point here is that the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire had it easy, okay, when they expanded across the Mediterranean. The climate was stable, there were no huge hordes of invaders coming unexpectedly out of nowhere, and the worst enemies were the Parthians and the Persians, who were dangerous, yes, but never really an existential threat. They never really threatened to completely destroy the Roman Empire. However, things were different starting from the 5th century AD. Climate became unstable, making the economy difficult to manage. Unstoppable hordes of savage nomads like the Huns and the Avars started appearing out of the unexplored depths of Central Asia, destroying everything in their path. Yet Byzantium survived. The West collapsed, the East remained strong and stable. Then the plague came around 545 AD, and around 630 the new religion of Islam united the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula and launched them towards a round of unstoppable conquest that brought them from Spain to China. Yet Byzantium survived, if only barely. They lost the entirety of the Middle East after the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, but they survived. The Byzantines pulled together their empire, they resisted, they invented history's first chemical flamethrowers, Google Greek fire to know more, and by the 11th century they had reconquered many of their territories and established the Byzantine Empire again as a great power in the Mediterranean. Then the Turks arrived, also out of the unexplored depths of Central Asia, and they began conquering everything. They defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, which you see here in the picture, imprisoned the Emperor Romanus IV, and to make a very interesting and very long story short, they would be the ones who killed the empire 400 years later in 1453, as they conquered Constantinople. It was not the Arabs, it was the Turks. But things were not going well in the West either. The Catholic Crusaders were often envious and mistrustful of the Byzantines and tried to conquer the Byzantine Balkans throughout all the Middle Ages. In 1204, for example, they got involved in a succession crisis. So, again, it's very complicated, but some guy said, you know what, I'm the rightful emperor, you Western Crusaders, you follow me, you'll get a lot of money. He didn't have the money, so the Crusaders essentially sacked and occupied Constantinople. When read in a quick sequence, as we just did, all these events speak of constant decline, of a disaster after another, until eventually on the 29th of May of 1453, the last Byzantine emperor is killed, and we can leave this mess behind us forever. However, we need to remember two things. Byzantium lasted for more than 1,000 years, and almost every time they were able to pull themselves together, crisis after crisis, and rebuild, while waiting for the next one, which invariably arrived, and was a big one. During the Middle Ages, and that's the second point, the lands of the Byzantine Empire were in the middle of all sorts of historical trends, such as plagues, massive migrations, invasions, climate change, religious storms. It is almost impossible in history to find another single state that was able to survive and prosper for so long in a similar situation. Yet the Byzantines did. And here we see one of the most famous pieces of Byzantine art. It's a restored version of the Menologion of Basil II, which shows the victorious emperor holding the spear while Foreign dignitaries just bow towards him. He is crowned by God, his weapon is surrounded by the angels, and is also surrounded by saints. He's the emperor, come on. So, why were they significant? What have the Byzantines ever done for us? Quite a lot, indeed, quite a lot. Since it's been a very long lesson already, I think we can just identify three main things and then call it a day. First, they preserved classical culture. Most of what we know of ancient literature and philosophy we owe to the Byzantines. Without them, important works on math, philosophy, geometry, law, architecture, military strategy would have been lost forever. They were the ones, also, if you're not into useful stuff, theatre. They were also the ones who copied the manuscripts one by one. They were the ones who made summaries of the most important works, and they were the ones who decided what was to be copied and what was not important enough to be copied. Without them, there would have been no Renaissance, and without as we know it, and without the Renaissance, our society would be incredibly different. Second, they spread the Christian religion in Eastern Europe. If a huge and hugely powerful country like Russia is Orthodox instead of Catholic, we owe it to the Byzantines, for the good or the bad, and the Russian Orthodox religion played a hugely important role in Russian history and in Russia's growth as a world power. Finally, the Byzantine, without looking at all the incidents in which they influenced Western political history, they influenced art. Indeed, they were the standard of medieval art in the West, and for centuries Westerners tried to imitate Byzantine art everywhere from England to Spain. Here we see, I think, one of the best pieces of Byzantine art in the world, a page from the Paris Psalter, showing King David from the Bible composing the Psalms, while here you got a personification of creativity. This is a very classical thing, a very Greek thing to do, a very ancient thing to do, personifying a virtue. And this connects with what we said about the Greek mind before, while again a personification of the river, of the mountains of Bethlehem, watches him. Again, the Western art in the Middle Ages only much later was able to produce such things. So, again, there are many more reasons, many more things I should say, could say, and want to say, but this lesson is already long as it is. Looking forward to read what you can write, and see you next time.